Hello. You're watching a recording of Dr. David Alff's presentation, How the Northeast Became an Acela Corridor, hosted by the Alexandria Historical Society on January 22nd, 2025. For those of you who are just hearing about us for the first time, the Alexandria Historical Society is a nonprofit educational organization that promotes an active interest in American history, particularly the history of Alexandria, Virginia, and the wider Washington metropolitan region. We host lectures and special events throughout the year, and we publish a journal, the Alexandria Chronicle. We issue grants to support research, preservation, and interpretation projects, and we host an annual awards ceremony to recognize the best of public history in the region. We couldn't do any of this work without the support of our members. Memberships start at just $30 for a year, and a membership gets you free access to our history events, discounted admission to our history behind the scenes experiences, and first access to new issues of the Alexandria Chronicle. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can sign up at our website. We'll include a link to it in the video description. We are very excited to welcome Dr. Alff and hear his insights on the history of the Northeast Corridor and its connections to the Washington region. David Alff is a professor of English at the State University of New York, Buffalo, where he focuses on infrastructure, public works, and 17th and 18th century Anglophone writing and performance. He is the author of The Northeast Corridor, The Trains, the People, the History of the Region, which chronicles the history of America's busiest passenger rail corridor. He is also the author of The Wreckage of Intentions, Projects in British Culture 1660 to 1730. He has also written numerous journal articles discussing the complex interactions between infrastructure projects and the literary world. Dr. Alff earned his BA from Haverford College and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. We are grateful to Dr. Alff for not only speaking to us and sharing his insights, but also for agreeing to let us record the presentation so that it can be shared with everyone. Due to some technical difficulties, Dr. Alff does not appear on screen, but all of his slides are present, and his talk and the accompanying Q&A are presented in full. Please enjoy. Dr. Alff, who is joining us from tropical and sunny upstate New York. David, take it away.
Thank you, Scott, for your introduction. Thank you, Scott and Audrey, for inviting me to speak tonight. And also, thank you, Scott, for your really thoughtful review of my book, which got this whole conversation started. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in from what I hear is frigid Northern Virginia. And I'm especially just thrilled and joyed to see the Morell family joining us, our dear friends in Arlington. I wrote the first tentative sentences of a book proposal for this project in their home 7 or 8 years ago. So it's so gratifying to see that come full circle. It's good to be here, if virtually. And please let me know in the chat if you can't see slides or have problems hearing me. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes and then open things up to question, answer, and discussion. So I live in New York, not New York City, but New York State, at the far end of the Thruway, at the last lock of the Erie Canal, at the second to last stop on Amtrak's Empire service, in the Rust Belt border town of Buffalo. I live in Buffalo, but come from the eastern seaboard, specifically the suburbs outside Philadelphia. Growing up in Bucks County, we used to watch trains rush through Croydon, Pennsylvania. It was the 80s. I remember stainless steel SEPTA commuter coaches clacking by, some bearing the faded logo of their former operator, the Penn Central. I remember Amtrak's new Swedish-designed AEM-7 electric locomotives towing their endless columns of Amfleet coaches. I learned about these trains and others from my late grandfather, Richard Delaney of the Bronx, who was a prolific rail fan and son-in-law of a Long Island Railroad engineer, my great-grandfather. My 9-year-old daughter, Mira, has inherited the family's fascination with trains. It's in her blood. Mira knows which whistles go with freight and which belong to Amtrak. She knows that the arrival of the Toronto-bound Maple Leaf in downtown Buffalo signals the end of her school day. Like me, Mira's happy to pack a lunch and hit the platforms with a sketch pad or notebook, but unlike me, she has a perfect knack for color coordination. When I moved from Philadelphia to Buffalo in 2012, I became starkly aware of being from the Northeast. I felt it in my patterns of speech, my pace walking sidewalks, my allergy to driving. And I realized that a big part of what I missed about home were its trains. There were so many of them that I rode, and even more that I saw at Croydon and later heard from my apartment in downtown Philly. I missed the sizzle of catenary, the pungency of creosote, the cherry almond scent of Amtrak soap, the fake oak interiors of New Jersey transit coaches. I missed the coming and going and that feeling of being looped into something beyond my home. I missed the look of 30th Street Station in winter sunlight and the smell of Trenton's track bed after spring rain. And so, in Buffalo, in the lonely depths of the pandemic, a time when few of us were going anywhere, I wrote a book about a railroad and the places it connects, including the place that I'm from. I wrote specifically about the tracks that solder Boston to Providence, New Haven, New York, Trenton, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, Washington, uh, Wilmington, Baltimore, Washington, and many points in between, and how those tracks became what we now call the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor is the busiest and fastest inner-city passenger rail line in North America. Corridor trains carry some 800,000 riders each day, a head count greater than the populations of Seattle, Denver, and San Francisco. Trains deliver those people to hundreds of thousands of jobs, including 1/3 of all Fortune 100 firms, 263 colleges within 5 miles of a station, and over 30% of civilization's most visited museums. The line links one of the world's most powerful financial centers to its most consequential political capital. Economists estimate that closing the corridor for a single day would sacrifice $100 million worth of labor to gridlock. The line enables 17% of the country's entire population to live on less than 2% of its land. The corridor is a gift from history and a tool for survival. While testifying before Congress, Temple University President John Fry called it America's greatest transportation asset. So great is this asset that the word corridor has grown synonymous with its region. People do not simply ride the corridor, but live there too. Once home to tens of thousands of Algonquins, this coastal band between Virginia and Maine became a beachfront for colonial settlement, a testbed for the Industrial Revolution, a fiscal laboratory, source of global policy, and a new order of space that the Ukrainian-French geographer Jean Gottman called megalopolis. Like Rust Belt, Deep South, Silicon Valley, and Appalachia, corridor has become shorthand for what many think of as the region's defining features. Its brisk pace of life, diversity, and comparative affluence. But as I show in my book, that's barely half the story. As any passenger can tell you, the corridor races through forests and along shorelines, past weedy lots and chemical plants, through villages and cities and marsh. Yes, Manhattan, but also Saybrook. Washington, sure, but don't forget Aberdeen, Bridgeport, Mystic, and the rest. I believe you can learn more about the Northeast from gazing out a coach window than from reading 100 editorials. But there's also so much that we can't know from simply riding a train. There is so much that I didn't know or didn't fully appreciate until I undertook all these years of research. While today's corridor may feel like a single seamless piece of infrastructure, it's really a patchwork of many railroads whose names live on in archives. I doubt many passengers of the 21st century have heard of the Boston and Providence, the Harlem River and Port Chester, the Camden and Amboy, the Philadelphia and Trenton, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, and the Baltimore and Potomac, even as they coast over those carriers' former rights of way. And many of those ways are older than the railroads they host. Some pieces of the corridor originated as colonial post routes and indigenous trails. In Metro Park, New Jersey, one of my personal favorite corridor train watching hotspots, the busy tracks run beside Route 27, which you can see here. Route 27 is a segment of the original first transcontinental highway. And before it was part of that highway, it was a piece of a road network commissioned by England's King Charles II in the 1660s. And before it was part of the King's Highway, it was a Dutch fur traders trail. And before it was a Dutch fur traders trail, it was the Lenape-Assunpink trace. So today's trains follow a lot of footsteps along some deeply rutted ways. And that's what makes the corridor, at least to me, such a fascinating historical subject. The line was never a neat and tidy project, a Shinkansen bullet train, a TGV, or for that matter, an interstate highway. Rather, the line came together intermittently, over time, like a row of bushes that hedged together. For centuries, Maryland track gangs, Boston Brahmins, German swamp drainers, Irish baggage smashers, and Mexican braceros had no idea that they were building something together and that what they were building would outlast them all. Today's corridor passengers blast over bridges like this one that were raised when Andrew Jackson was president. They careen around curves embanked by Civil War veterans and plunge through tunnels older than the Titanic. Their fellow riders have at different moments included Frederick Douglass, Albert Einstein, Duke Ellington, Chris Christie, Barack Obama, Leopold Stokowski, Marianne Moore, King Charles III, the Phillies, the Nationals, and so many more. New Haven writer George Gershwin recalled that it was suddenly on the train with its steely rhythms, its rattle-tee-bang, that I suddenly heard Rhapsody in Blue from beginning to end. John Coltrane saw, heard, and most certainly felt those same percussive tracks which ran right behind his Philadelphia row home at 1511 North 33rd Street. Today, the historic corridor is again a construction site where some of America's most ambitious and expensive infrastructural projects are coming to life. The new Frederick Douglass Tunnel that will burrow under the streets of Baltimore, a new Susquehanna River Bridge, a new Gateway Bridge over the Hackensack River in New Jersey, new tunnels under the Hudson River, and maybe even a reimagined Penn Station that will build upon the civic momentum behind Moynihan Train Hall. Given all these investments and attention, I think it's a good time to get to know what we have inherited. The corridor is a vital, often vexing public work in the public eye at a moment when many of us wonder whether the country's fraying quilt of roads, bridges, railroads, sewers, dams, and pipelines will hold together or collapse. A time when regional identity holds existential political weight. We need to know more about the corridor's past to understand where the line will lead us next. Tonight, I'm going to talk specifically, I'm going to pull some stories out of the book that focus specifically on the corridor's most southwestern point, Washington and its greater environs. The District of Columbia is both terminus and gateway, the end of the line, as well as what writer Isabel Wilkerson called the start of the North. But for many district passengers, Washington is neither a start nor an end because so many Amtrak trains proceed southbound from Union Station by diesel power under Capitol Hill, under the basements of the Supreme Court and Library of Congress, out across the Potomac Long Bridge to Alexandria, Richmond, Newport News, Norfolk, Roanoke, and beyond. My talk tonight is going to focus pretty heavily on Union Station, how we came to have it, then almost lost it, and what has happened to it along the way. But I'm also going to pan out to think more broadly about the region and Alexandria's role in corridors past and future. Part 1, Dreaming a National Mall. No place on the corridor resembles Washington. The District of Columbia was never a congested ocean port like Boston or a smoking factory town like Philadelphia. The capital's marble shrines leave space for lawn and sky. Nothing blemishes or protrudes in the so-called city of magnificent distances, a city that takes its shape straight from the Constitution, which called for, and I quote, a district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by cession of particular states and acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States. The men who ratified these words in 1787 wanted the capital to reflect their classical pretensions and Enlightenment ideals, but they couldn't decide where to put it. Northerners wanted the federal city to sit beside the Hudson River or perhaps outside of Trenton. Virginia offered Williamsburg as one potential site. Maryland proposed Annapolis as another. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton convinced the Virginians Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to sponsor the federal assumption of state war debts in return for platting the District of Columbia on the banks of the Potomac River. This is the same backroom deal that Lin-Manuel Miranda immortalized in Hamilton. President George Washington hired the Parisian painter and veteran Pierre-Charles L'Enfant to convert this backwater of tobacco fields and whitewashed cabins into a piece of metropolitan art. L'Enfant imagined a grand capital, and I'm sure for residents of the DC area, probably many of you are familiar with this image of L'Enfant's plan. As you can see, this plan would overlay Philadelphia's gridiron pattern with Paris's radial avenues, traffic circles, and a boulevard from Jenkins Heights, site of the so-called Congress House, to Washington's Monument, an equestrian statue south of the presidential palace that is today the Washington Monument. L'Enfant's vision combined the rigidity of graphing paper with the sinuousness of a spider web. L'Enfant worried not about budgets or mosquitoes, tidal mud, or dust storms. He was, however, terrified that speculators would find his blueprints and jump on prime real estate. L'Enfant became paranoid. Washington grew impatient. He fired the Frenchman and hired surveyor Andrew Ellicott to scale back his predecessor's grandiosity. Among Ellicott's most striking revisions was his decision to turn L'Enfant's Champs-Élysées to the Potomac into a tree-lined promenade or mall. In 1800, federal legislators left Philadelphia, which was then the capital, for this new city in progress. Early reviews were not good. Charles Dickens called Washington a monument of a deceased project, a place of magnificent intentions. Actor Tyrone Power likened the district's, quote, gloomy and unimproved landscapes to the prairies of Arkansas. The district had no university, no classes of students in science or literature, no philosophical societies, no people who seemed to have any leisure, lamented London geologist Charles Lyell. L'Enfant, people thought, had created not a city, but its shell. Early Washingtonians could not reconcile his ambitious plan with its empty reality, what Henry Adams called the immensity of the task and the paucity of the means. Nowhere did Washington's stifled potential appear starker than on the National Mall, a tattered waste where residents planted crops and grazed cows. To the mall's north oozed Washington Canal. To the mall's south stood brick pens from which slaves were driven to auction at Lafayette Square until 1862. Quote, The voices of patriotic representatives boasting of freedom and equality, and the rattling of the poor slave's chain almost commingled, recalled Solomon Northrop, a freeborn New York musician imprisoned at what is now 1800 Independence Avenue. After the Civil War, B Street paved over the putrid canal. Coffles no longer trudged past Congress, and the mall became many things at once. An evergreen arboretum, a botanical garden, a cattle depot, and an experimental farm where the Department of Agriculture tested strains of sorghum and rye. In 1851, landscape designer Andrew Downing planted trees around the Smithsonian's Norman Castle headquarters. His gardening injected wilderness back into the Capitol, smearing L'Enfant's right angles with brush strokes of the picturesque. The mall then became, of all things, a rail yard. Trains arrived in Washington in 1835 when the Baltimore and Ohio opened the district's first station. The B&O enjoyed a state-sanctioned monopoly until 1859 when the Pennsylvania Railroad subsidiary, the Baltimore and Potomac, entered the capital as well. The B&P flouted state law that gave the Baltimore and Ohio a monopoly by opening a line between Bowie and Pope's Creek, Maryland. From this line, they extended a branch to the southern edge of the National Mall. The branch was somehow legal and thereafter became the main line for Pennsylvania Railroad trains from Baltimore and beyond. In 1872, Federal District Marshal Frederick Douglass exclaimed that Washington was, quote, no longer isolated from the outside world and dependent on a single railroad. No sooner had the Baltimore and Potomac accessed Washington than it began lobbying Congress for permission to erect a new terminal closer to the district's business center. This plan would have entailed laying tracks across the mall. Some members of Congress regarded the proposed extension as an act of progress. If you want to make Washington a pleasant place, make it a useful place, reasoned Connecticut Representative Henry Starkweather. Others condemned the terminal scheme as a desecration of sacred greensward. By no consent of Congress, chided Charles Sumner, would I allow any business interest or disturbing railroad company to fasten itself upon this enclosure. Sumner continued, there is a place for all things, and this I know, the place for a railway station is not a public park. In a sign of the times of industrialization and association of industrialization with progress, the Baltimore and Potomac got its way. By 1873, trains rolled across the mall to a black iron shed that jutted through L'Enfant's parade ground. This is 6th Street here. Citizens complained about the tracks and the carriages parked on them, about the coal lumps scattered pell-mell, the hissing valves and clanging bells, and the smoke spoiling Washington's vistas. The new Baltimore and Potomac station not only diminished Columbia's beauty, but exposed its seedy underbody. Arriving passengers now deboarded on the edge of Murder Bay, a ferocious red light district steps from the mall. I'll talk about this in a bit, but Murder Bay became what we would now call Federal Triangle. But before Congress improved the B&P extension, a 40-year-old representative from Ohio pondered Washington's busy tracks and haphazard terminals. James Garfield foresaw more trains converging on the Capitol, more passengers disembarking wherever carriers could acquire land, more chaos. On March 26, 1872, Garfield asked his colleagues to dedicate, quote, some place in the city for a Union Depot building, which will accommodate all railroads and to which all railroads shall come. While Congress fought over a single strip of the mall, Garfield wanted to concentrate all Washington train activity within one square of L'Enfant's grid. His ambitious vision died on the floor. 9 years later, now President Garfield marched through the BNP station that he once claimed to be redundant. A spurned spoil seeker named Charles Guiteau sprang from the women's waiting room, pulled an ivory-handled British bulldog revolver, and fired twice. One bullet glanced off Garfield's arm, another stuck in his abdomen. Garfield survived the attack, but not the doctors, who plunged their unsanitized hands through his wounds. The president grew febrile as his blood festered. The excessively hot night of September 5th gave Garfield fits. His temperature spiked, his pulse raced. A guarded entourage carried the president onto a train bound for New Jersey, where doctors hoped the salt air would slow his infection. The train eased out of Washington through a tunnel directly beneath the jail cell where Guiteau awaited trial. It thundered over the tracks of the BMP, the PW&B, and the PRR, which diverted all other trains onto sidings. Garfield arrived at the seaside village of Elberon, New Jersey, where workers laid temporary rails to the front door of Charles Franklin's mansion. To prevent any unnecessary jar or shock, workers pushed the bedridden president's car by hand the final feet across the mansion's front lawn. Garfield died 17 days later. Part 2. A New White City. Washington would not consider a comprehensive terminal solution until 1900, when the American Institute of Architects held its annual meeting at the Arlington Hotel. The visiting architects bemoaned their shabby surroundings. Everywhere, they saw L'Enfant's vision betrayed. In his opening remarks at the conference, AIA President Robert Peabody pledged to, quote, make our government architecture more worthy of the greatness and intelligence of the Republic. Conversation turned to the mall. This is looking north toward the Capitol building, or I guess not north. I guess it'd be looking east toward the Capitol building. It's a little bit hard to see at the end there. You can see that black bar jutting from the left of the screen into the mall. That's the Baltimore and Potomac station. So conversation of the architects, they turned to the mall. Frederick Law Olmsted, who was in attendance, urged his colleagues to treat the BMP tracks as a border, marking the terminus of one unit of the plan. Others favored ripping up the rails and reclaiming the park for pedestrians. All agreed that a committee of architects, landscapers, and artists should sort out the Capitol. The architects revered L'Enfant, but probably drew more direct inspiration from another time and place. In 1893, Chicago hosted the equivalent of a World's Fair. The Columbian Exposition hailed a new era in urban planning. Members of the so-called City Beautiful movement claimed that genteel parks and stately boulevards could uplift city dwellers. To the AIA, Chicago's architectural pantheon offered a glorious example of how L'Enfant's blueprints might rematerialize. Once a maze of stockyards and hovels, Chicago offered hope that Washington could still become a magnificent and consistent piece of art. In March 1901, the Senate put Michigander James McMillan in charge of Washington's resurrection. McMillan assembled a commission that included the Columbia Exposition's mastermind, Daniel Burnham, and his associates, Charles Follen McKim, Frederick Law Olmsted, and the Beaux-Arts sculptor Augustus Saint-Gaudens. Several commissioners toured Europe, combing Rome, Vienna, Versailles, London, and Frankfurt for artifacts of old world design that they could bring back to the Potomac. Their report ultimately called for a lot of what we think of as Washington today: winding parkways, regal memorials, a Federal Triangle office complex to bury Murder Bay's brothels, and the revitalization of the National Mall as what the AIA called a monumental core. The commissioners concluded that a dignified approach to the Capitol required, quote, the exclusion of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad from public grounds. Washington's trains, they reasoned, should share a single station. The murdered president James Garfield's Union Depot concept now returned to life, grandly reconceived as a transportation temple superior to any structure erected for railways. At the end of his European fact-finding mission, Daniel Burnham pitched Pennsylvania Railroad Chief Executive Officer Alexander Cassatt, who was vacationing in London. The patriotic Cassatt quickly reconciled capital beautification with his railroad's bottom line interest. Ever since the Pennsylvania had gained a controlling share of its former rival, the B&O, a combined terminal made economic sense. In return for vacating the mall, the PRR received federal money to dig a tunnel beneath Capitol Hill for trains running south to Virginia. The district reclaimed its signature park. Senator McMillan praised Cassatt for treating the terminal project as a national matter. In keeping with City Beautiful ideals, planners located the new station atop a slum called Swampoodle, which you can see here looking from this photograph taken from the roof of the Capitol building. Swampoodle was everything that offended L'Enfant, Downing, and McMillan. A quagmire where flimsy shacks teetered over Tiber Creek and free-range goats browsed on garbage. The neighborhood took its name from its abundance of puddles, which one reporter described as, quote, solvent of the miscellaneous foulness of which they are made the receptacles and the resort. This is a photograph of Swampoodle grounds, home of the original Washington Nationals who were in play here in 1886. Residents of the Swampoodle neighborhood included famine-ravished Irish immigrants and so-called contrabands. These were Black Americans who escaped plantation slavery and came to Washington. The conditions in Swampoodle were so bad that Southern writers, pro-slavery writers, would come to Washington and describe in lurid detail the neighborhood to suggest that people were better off enslaved on plantations. And they weren't the only ones to come to Swampoodle. Journalists of all stripes found brawling mobs and cutthroat gangs to pepper their bylines. If Swampoodle exposed Congress's negligence, Union Station gave legislators a chance to bury their shame. Before construction began, millions of cubic tons of rocky fill were dumped on the slum, as if to sop up its pervasive dampness. Over this base rose the largest train terminal in the world. The station commission naturally went to Daniel Burnham's firm, which borrowed its floor plan from the Roman baths of Diocletian, an ancient structure that accommodated up to 3,000 recreating citizens in the 3rd century. Colossal Union Station would welcome Americans to their own forum. Passengers would enter Massachusetts Avenue through Ionic colonnades adorned with statues sculpted by Louis Saint-Gaudens, brother of the commissioner Augustus Saint-Gaudens, and a carved inscription from Samuel Johnson. They waited in a barrel-vaulted hall, guarded by statues of imperial soldiers, backlit by geometric window traceries. Riders departed through a cavernous shed to the platforms. Union Station would receive trains over the Pennsylvania Railroad's new Magruder branch, an ostensible branch of the old Pope's Creek line that became the corridor's southernmost trackage. The Magruder branch, in many ways, is like the last piece of the Northeast Corridor, the part that runs from roughly New Carrollton to Union Station today. When Union Station opened in 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered the demolition of the vacant B&P terminal so that work could begin on McMillan's new and revamped mall. The site sat empty for years while people debated what to do with it. Those ruins eventually became the National Gallery of Art. Today, the gallery's West Wing displays American masterpieces, including several oil paintings by Mary Cassatt, sister of Pennsylvania Railroad President Alexander Cassatt. In the same air where her brother's locomotives stood at the mall, and where a president crumpled over in gunfire, now hang portraits of children wearing straw hats, a girl lounging on a blue armchair, a man rowing a lime rowboat across an azure lake, and a single woman holding a perfect red zinnia. Part 3. Crashing into Washington. Washington would receive a heaping share of corridor history over the coming decades. Union Station appears for the first time, or near to the first time, in this May 1909 Pennsylvania Railroad schedule for fast express trains between New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. Union Station would receive electrical catenary. Those are the overhead lines that allow trains to run on alternating current in 1934, thanks to funds from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Depression-era Public Works Administration, which is, of course, headquartered just blocks away. Subsequently, DC's Capitol building would form the striking backdrop for this poster depicting a Pennsylvania Railroad train pulled by the iconic GG1 electric engine. These images reflect what my book calls the corridor's zenith, the peak of American passenger railroading. After World War II, the expansion of interstate highways, growth of personal automobile travel, expansion of cheap bus service, and advent of commercial flight would sap rider revenue. By the 1950s, the Northeastern railroading scene had turned decidedly bleak. And that's where I'm going to pick up with what has to be the wildest story in Union Station history. It had been a grim week on the Pennsylvania Railroad when the sun rose on January 15th, 1953. A freight train had derailed in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, causing 10-hour delays. In Trenton, a turnpike commissioner and rail opponent named Paul Trost filed papers to run for governor of New Jersey. At Penn Station, the renowned Radio City concert violinist Isidor Gralnack slipped off the platform and was crushed to death by a commuter train. Down the line in Maryland, Henry Brower, engineer for the Pennsylvania Railroad's Federal Express, had no reason to be thinking about any of these things when he applied the brakes to his GG1 engine and nothing happened. Brower lived in a tidy brick row home in West Philadelphia. He had worked 17 of his 66 years as an engineer on the PRR. A model employee, Brower piloted the inaugural Morning Congressional in 1952. This photograph from the day's festivities finds him in thick spectacles and denim overalls, smiling next to the fur-coated Elizabeth Jane Barclay, Second Lady of the United States. When interviewed about the new train, Brower commended its, quote, amazing new safety device that would read trackside signals and automatically regulate speed. On January 15th, GG1 4876, Brower's engine had no functional brakes, automatic or otherwise. Brower slammed his engine into an emergency stop. He threw it into reverse. He dropped sand under the wheels. Nothing worked. What Brower did not know, could not know, was that the fourth coach's air brake had sealed shut, probably from a falling icicle, and there was nothing he could do to restore pressure. When I came under New York Avenue, I started to blow the horn on the engine to notify the people that we couldn't hold the train or to scare them away from the platform, he later testified at a Senate committee hearing. The Federal Express had, at least until that morning, offered a rare ray of hope in the dismal world of post-war railroading. The popular overnight train was a joint production of the New Haven and Pennsylvania Railroads. It departed Boston South Station at 11 p.m. and arrived in Washington the next morning. On January 15th, normal riders every day, regular riders were rousing themselves from sleep and polishing off continental breakfasts when they realized something was wrong. The train hurtled past Ivy City Coachyard, C Tower, K Tower, the landmarks that told passengers when to pull their suitcases down from luggage racks. We were going too fast when all of a sudden the motion became jerky, recalled Eleanor Johnson, a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun. Seconds later, the Federal ran out of track. Engine fireman John William Moyer estimated that the train was going around 35, maybe 40 miles an hour when it whipped past Union Station's platforms and crashed through the bumper at the end of track 16. The Federal plowed through a newsstand, entered the station, and skidded over the concourse's Vermont marble floor. The GG1 slid just far enough to shine its headlight into the main waiting room, where passengers scattered. Then the floor gave way. The 215-ton engine plunged into the basement mailroom. Its pantograph reached into empty air. The New Haven coaches piled up like strewn toys. The station master called for fire engines and for morphine, but no fire erupted, and no one died, not even Brower, who remained at his controls the whole time, tugging his whistle until the engine outran its power. Doctors treated injured riders. Workers threw plywood boards over the gashed concourse floor and heaped sacks of quick-drying asphalt over the planks. Dwight D. Eisenhower would become president 5 days later. An intact Union Station was needed to handle inaugural crowds. Crews chopped up the engine and shipped its salvageable parts to Altoona, where it was eventually reassembled. Part 4. Saving Union Station. By mid-century, Northeasterners were abandoning urban cores and temperamental trains. Downtown terminals like Boston's South Station, Philadelphia's Broad Street Station, and New York's Pennsylvania Station now seemed ludicrously overbuilt. The latter two structures, Broad Street and Penn Station, fell to the wrecking ball, and Boston South Station survived, but in a pretty diminished form, having lost a lot of its original architectural glory. Washington's Union Station, shown here a bit later in 1974, quickly fell into its own limbo. The Pennsylvania Railroad could no longer afford to maintain the deteriorating Roman palace that it co-owned with the Baltimore and Ohio. The railroads proposed removing passenger operations to a smaller station on the district outskirts. Executives met Smithsonian officials to talk about turning Union Station into a transportation museum. Congress later voted to convert the terminal waiting room into a bicentennial welcome center. The center received a 3,000-car garage and heliport, murals, and a slideshow theater, derisively nicknamed the Pit, that plunged straight through the marble floor. Trains would park out back at a replacement station. The National Park Service proved no better at stewarding Union Station than did the private railroads. The critically panned visitor center closed in 1978. I think you could maybe see why from this picture. They said that apparently some of the slideshows that they showed here would be of things like the Capitol building. And somebody once said, well, you could also just like walk 10 feet out the door and look at the real Capitol building. Anyway, Visitor Center was a failure, and Union Station fell back into abandonment. 2 years later, in 1980, Washington Post reporter Blaine Hardin found a vacant station that, quote, smells of rot, toadstools grow on soggy maple floors, and fetid rainwater drips from light bulbs long since gone dark. In the evacuated offices and hallways upstairs, roaches the size of mice and rats the size of telephones flit amid shards of peeled paint and puddles of mud. New Yorker editor and train aficionado Rogers E.M. Whitaker seethed during a visit to the replacement station connected to Union Station, which he found at the end of a quarter mile of plywood rampart. It is so ugly Everything about it is ugly. This station looks like a bad small town bus terminal. God, what a depressing place, he wrote. Union Station teetered on the brink of oblivion. Its comeback would be achingly slow. It began in 1974 when President Richard Nixon signed the Regional Rail Reorganization Act. The act paved the way for the fledgling National Rail Passenger Corporation, known to its friends as Amtrak, to acquire most of the Northeast Corridor. The line between Boston and Washington would become Amtrak's home turf. It was and remains some of the only tracks in America where the conveyance of people takes priority over the delivery of stuff. Then Nixon's second vice president and eventual sudden successor, Gerald Ford, allocated $1.75 billion to modernize the corridor through the so-called Northeast Corridor Improvement Program, or NECIP. NECIP projects included new corridor stations in Stamford and the Baltimore-Washington International Airport. It also paid to hire crews to clear underbrush, cars, appliances, garbage from the tracks. Painters slapped fresh coats on rusting corridor bridges. Mechanics automated Maryland's Bush River drawbridge. Workers fenced off crossings, dug drainage ditches, and replaced catenary. A bright orange work train, nicknamed the Monster, spooled out miles of welded rail and replaced wooden ties with concrete ones. Besides these technical structural improvements, NECIP funds also underwrote station renovations so that passengers could feel, in the words of a New York Times reporter, connected to the Northeast in a solid, permanent way. Architect Marilyn Taylor noted this attitude shift while restoring Baltimore Penn Station's mosaic tile floors and Tiffany skylights. Once seen as processing places to move people, stations had become what Taylor called a visible and meaning symbol of the community. This appreciation for cultural history would guide the corridor's splashiest aesthetic improvement, a revived Union Station. Following its ill-thought conversion into a visitor center, Daniel Burnham's Capitol Gateway followed familiar scripts of ruined pornography, the leaky ceilings, the fungus, the rats. Plywood ramps diverted passengers around the stewing chamber to the replacement station, which one writer called Hitler's bunker. The rot grew too much for President Ronald Reagan. Ordinarily an opponent of passenger rail spending, Reagan nonetheless signed the Union Station Redevelopment Act in 1981. Reagan pledged to restore Union Station, in his words, as a commerce center with access to several modes of transportation. Notably, his signing speech mentions neither Amtrak nor trains, underscoring the project's focus on retail and restaurants. In the end, Washington got to take a mulligan on its neglected palace. Saved by a combination of civic will and accidental good luck, Union Station would take years of attention from craftspeople before it could reopen. The ceilings were reglazed, repainted, and regilded. The floor's red marble inlays were refreshed with stone cut from the same Vermont quarry that Daniel Burnham had sourced 80 years earlier. A horologist refurbished the waiting hall clock. Technicians cut HVAC ducts into walls. At one point, crews uncovered the plywood and asphalt that workers had flung over the hole that the runaway Federal Express had punched into the floor. On September 9, 1988, Amtrak welcomed visitors to an event dubbed the Great Reunion. Like 30th Street and Baltimore's Penn Station, the old and improved Union Station came with new commerce. The developers had partnered with several companies to convert the former train concourse into 3 stories of shops and restaurants. John Bortz, vice president of one of the project's subcontractors, characterized the barrel vaulted room as Washington's newest social destination. People would come to Union Station not simply to board trains for elsewhere, but to eat, drink, and shop in the presence of transit. Architecture critic Paul Goldberger noted the subtle conversion of train hall into festival mall. Though he commended the painstaking work that restored Union Station's turn-of-the-century architecture and recognized the compromises needed to pull off such a job in an age of federal spending cuts and public-private partnerships, he sensed an underlying spiritual cost. The revamped terminal was, in his words, almost too clean, too fresh, too new, and a bit too suburban. Train stations were, Goldberger claimed, supposed to have a slightly shadowy, musty air. It should look like a black and white photograph. Union Station now gleams, Goldberger conceded, but it has lost the sound of time. Part 5, Today and Tomorrow. The revived Union Station would host several memorable moments in recent corridor history. These include the departure of the first Acela Express train on November 16, 2000, an event that NPR's Jack Speer likened to the launch of an ocean liner. In January 2009, President-elect Barack Obama's inaugural express arrived at Union Station to great fanfare. This is the period when I got to know the terminal quite well. While commuting back and forth from my graduate program in Philly, first to a research fellowship at the Folger Shakespeare Library, and later an adjunct teaching gig at Georgetown. Decades after its reopening, Union Station has always felt like a destination to me, a place to hug friends, a place to grab a beer after a long day of teaching or shuffling through the archives, a place to grade papers or browse books at the Barnes and Noble. Or at least it was. 2 summers ago, I entered Union Station for the first time in many years. It was shockingly empty. Anchor stores had closed, shoppers fled, the food court was moribund. No Barnes and Noble. Thank God for the Unos. The Unos was still there. If nothing else, save the Union Station Unos. But overall, before me was visible wreckage of the COVID pandemic and also, almost certainly, the long-term effect of remote work in a region where many white-collar professionals need not clock in or take trains to do their jobs. Despite its ever-resplendent classical architecture, gilded ceilings, the glory of Godin's, it all reminded me of one of those 80s-era malls that hadn't quite closed. This is probably because Union Station was redeveloped as an 80s-era mall, specifically the festival marketplace model of Boston's Faneuil Hall and Baltimore's once ballyhooed, now tired Inner Harbor. If this developmental trend is reaching its expiration, I wonder what comes next for this glorious building. One answer might come in the form of a $10 billion project to convert Union Station into a much larger transit hub and high-speed rail terminus. Beyond the station itself, developers envision what they have called a new neighborhood rising above the tracks that buried the old neighborhood, Swampoodle. Named after Union Station's architect, Burnham Place will, according to its website, match the quality of the original historic Union Station and the Macmillan Commission urban plan. As with all railroad infrastructure, the fate of Union Station depends upon developments elsewhere in the region. While most passengers enter the building to ride the Northeast Corridor, whether on Amtrak or MARC, Many are bound for Virginia, either on Amtrak or Virginia Railway Express. And they're taking these trains across the Potomac to a part of the country that has now seen decades of explosive commercial and residential growth. This growth is perhaps nowhere more evident than the former site of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Potomac Yard, which once sat just north of downtown Alexandria. The Pot Yard classification facility opened in 1906. It was a transfer point where freight trains were broken apart and recombined. The yard featured an ice house and coal tipple. At different points, up to 1,500 workers toiled in the yard, making it Alexandria's largest employer. The yard received electrical catenary in 1935, which meant that those emblems of Northeasternness, the GG1 shown here, roamed a few miles into the Old Dominion state. For reference, you can see the Washington Monument off to the left corner here. After some 75 years of service, the yard was gradually abandoned in the 80s and 90s. It then became a brownfield of dreams for developers who have proposed building up that site with everything from big box shopping centers to mixed use residential communities to new homes for the Capitals and Wizards. In nearby Crystal City, the first phase of Amazon's HQ2 project rises right beside the tracks that carry Amtrak and VRE passengers in and out of Washington. Amazon's presence means that the same region that once held one of the hemisphere's busiest rail yards will now host what has become the world's largest consumer logistical operation. The long history of Potomac Yard and its environs has vital implications for the future of passenger rail travel in the capital region. In 2020, the Virginia General Assembly created the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority to coordinate, promote, and expand train service in the Commonwealth. In 2021, Virginia acquired freight railroad CSX's own trackage to increase passenger capacity. Given the recent expansion of service, the state acquisition of railroad rights of way, the groundbreaking for a new train bridge over the Potomac, as well as Amtrak's planned acquisition of aero trains that can run both on overhead catenary power and on battery in unelectrified zones, it wouldn't be too hard to imagine the extension of the current Northeast Corridor into Virginia. It's impossible to know at the moment. But as my book wagers, one of the best ways to understand this process is to pay attention to what's already happened. After 200 years, the corridor is still making the Northeast what it is. The train line is still arriving. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. And as a resident of Potomac Yard, I can just say that I've been watching some of the work that's been going on around there, and certainly it'd be really cool if that Northeast corridor, the speeds, the reliability, the frequency could be extended a little bit further into Virginia. So thank you again for sharing your insights with all of us. For anybody who has any questions for David, please drop them in the chat, and I'll pass them along to David, and he can teach us a little bit more about the history. So any questions from anybody?
I'm also just going to drop in the chat links. There's a 30% off discount from the press if anybody would like to order it from there, or if you'd like to order it for ask your local library to acquire it. Anything would be great. Thank you so much for the chance to talk to you all.
All right. Well, I've got a couple of questions, and hopefully that'll prompt a couple of folks to put their questions in the chat. It's always just kind of been striking to me that, you have this development of the Northeast Corridor, which, as you describe in the book, starts off as a bunch of these smaller railroads that gradually get closer and closer and closer together. And I've always just been very intrigued by the fact that it ended up being Washington to Boston. And even though there was and there continues to be passenger rail connections to Virginia to Richmond, that section's not really considered part of the Northeast Corridor. And David, I'd be curious if your research turned up anything relating to that as to why, Virginia is kind of adjacent to the Northeast Corridor, but not really part of it. It didn't get the electrification. It didn't get, the frequencies. Amtrak doesn't own the rails. I'd be curious if your research turned up anything relating to that.
One of the things that's so disorienting, if you look at maps of passenger rail networks in the late 19th, early 20th century, is you can't even find the lines that we recognize today because there's just so much more trackage. There's so many more carriers, there's so many more lines. And so part of what's funny is the Northeast Corridor is kind of like what's left after so many other closures and abandonment of other lines in the region. So I think a lot about the limits. Boston and Washington. Boston and Washington are obviously two of the largest cities in the region, but you also in Boston have a pretty robust Amtrak service and commuter service that goes northbound into New Hampshire and Maine. There's talk of a tunnel that would link South Station in Boston to North Station and thereby extend rails. And the same question to Virginia. I think part of it has to do with the Pennsylvania Railroad's finances. It did extend electrification into the Potomac Yard into Virginia. And I know that at different points there was talk of trying to establish higher speed rail service into Virginia and continuous passenger rail service. And at a certain point, the railroad ran out of money to the point that it was forced to seek a desperate merger of necessity with the New York Central and then eventually fell into bankruptcy. Um, so in many ways, I feel grateful that we have as much of the line as we do today. We're certainly in a better position than, say, Canada with respect to passenger rail infrastructure, but it would be obviously great to have high-speed service from Portland all the way to Richmond, or beyond to Charlotte and elsewhere with fast enough trains. Those become doable distances on rail.
Yep, absolutely, definitely. And as you alluded to in your presentation, that is something Virginia has been investing in, and the state bought some of the CSX tracks, and as you said, they're building the second long bridge over DC, which should hopefully allow for greater frequencies. Right now, that bridge is a major bottleneck, so we'll see what the future holds for that. Oh, and we've got a question. Is the freight traffic expanding on the Northeast Corridor?
The freight traffic has since Amtrak took control of the Northeast Corridor in the early gradual process from the late 70s to the early 80s. Freight has been a minimal presence on the corridor compared to other lines. Most freight uses other tracks. In the Northeast, those would be the former. So Amtrak took over failing passenger rail operations in the 1970s, and a federally backed company called Conrail took over the failing freight industry. Conrail was eventually sold off to the freight giants CSX and Norfolk Southern. So those are the two big freight railroads in the region, and they run most freight traffic around the corridor just because freight creates bottlenecks for fast passenger trains, and it's also extremely dangerous to have trains that are going 30 miles an hour and 150 miles an hour sharing the same tracks. So if one wants to, this doesn't mean that you won't see freight on the Northeast Corridor. There are trains every now and again, but you'll see them a lot elsewhere. One of the things that's very striking to me, living off the corridor now in Buffalo, is that if my daughter and I go out to write or to sketch pictures of trains outside the city, we will see 10 freight trains go by for every Amtrak train. There is enormous traffic, and the big, large freight conglomerates are handling a ton of traffic, and they're very, very profitable right now. So it's a kind of a different story. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, again, just want to thank you again, David, for speaking to us tonight about your research. Again, his book is The Northeast Corridor, the trains, the history of the people, the region. And he talks about, in the book, he talks about some of the stuff he talked about tonight, but also has stories up the entire corridor from DC all the way to Boston. So definitely recommend picking that up. Thank you to everyone who was very patient as we dealt with our tech issues. After this, we'll be reaching out to Zoom to figure out what happened. But again, we thank you for your patience. We thank you for attending. We thank you for supporting the Alexandria Historical Society. And we hope you stay connected with us in the future. Follow us on social media. Take a look at our website. And if you're interested, you can purchase a membership. Memberships start at only $30. So again, thank you, everyone. I hope everyone stays warm, whether you're in DC or up in Buffalo. And I hope everyone has a great night. All right. Thanks again, everyone.